Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us all today. My name's Samay Sahu, and I'm a 27 from Nashua, New Hampshire. At Dartmouth, I'm studying economics and sociology, and I'm also an ambassador for the Dartmouth Political Union. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the last conversation in the 100 Days Speaker Series program, focusing on tariffs and featuring Dominic Pino and Stephen Vaughn. The 100 Days series builds on Dartmouth's commitment to bringing diverse perspectives and expertise to our institution as we discuss focal policy areas impacted by the presidential transition. The series was created collaboratively with the Dartmouth Rockefeller Center, Dartmouth Democrats, Dartmouth Conservatives, and the Dartmouth Political Union, in cooperation with the Dartmouth Dialogues and Center for Business, Government, and Society, with the primary goal of fostering bipartisan conversation on key issues during the first 100 days of the presidential administration. We're truly grateful for these partnerships between students, faculty, departments, and centers on campus that brought this series to our community and gave us a chance to reflect and communicate key policy issues. We would like to welcome all of our virtual attendees who are joining us today via live stream. For those joining us in person, when we reach the audience Q&A portion of our program, you can raise your hand and one of our student assistants will bring you a microphone. Please be sure to wait for the microphone before speaking so that everyone in the room and on our live stream can hear you. As a reminder, Dartmouth is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent, as well as an open exchange of ideas and a culture of mutual respect. We ask that you do not interfere with or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guests and moderators, or interfering with our guests and moderators' ability to speak and be heard. Today's program will be co-moderated by Professor Douglas Irwin, the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth and co-director of the Dartmouth Political Economy Project. Professor Irwin will be joined by Student Representative Kavya Navarthi of the class of 2025. Kavya majors in economics and Chinese language. She has served as program captain of the Mock Trial Society, vice president of the nonpartisan Dartmouth Political Union, and was a Rockefeller Center first-year fellow, and has interned on Capitol Hill. Following graduation, she will work at Cornerstone Research in Washington, D.C., after which she hopes to attend law school. And now to welcome our visiting guests. Dominic Pino is the Thomas L. R. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute. He's also the host of the American Institute for Economic Research podcast, eConception. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in economics from George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Stephen Vaughn is a partner in the international trade team of King & Spalding, who works primarily on international trade litigation and policy matters. In April 2019, Stephen completed more than 2 years of service as the General Counsel for the Office of the United States Trade Representative. In that position, he managed a team of government attorneys representing U.S. interests in both trade negotiations and trade litigation. During 2 months in early 2017, Stephen also served as the acting U.S. Trade Representative. He is widely regarded as one of the world's foremost authorities on current U.S. trade policy, as well as one of the most talented U.S. trade remedy litigators. Stephen is recognized as a leading practitioner in trade remedies and trade policy by Legal 500 US, Chambers USA, and Chambers Global. He has been named a 2024 Client Service All-Star by BTI Consulting. We'd like to just thank you all one more time for enjoying us for one last serious conversation before Green Key Weekend begins. And please help me welcome Dominic Pino, Stephen Vaughn, Professor Irwin, and Kavya Navarthi to the front.
That introduction, and welcome to you all this afternoon on a Green Key weekend. Thank you for being here. I'm really pleased to be joined with Kavya in conducting this dialogue on trade policy, which is timely, topical, very important for the moment. And we have two great people from Washington, D.C. to help inform us about these debates. So let me sort of ask the first question, which is sort of setting the stage for the Trump administration in terms of its first term. So let's go back to, say, 2015. And just think about the trade landscape then in terms of U.S. trade policy. What, in both of your views, what was good, what was bad, what needed adjusting? Was that status quo acceptable? What sort of issues do you think we need to confront in 2015? So Dominic, why don't we start with you and then go to Stephen.
2015, I think that the overall trade picture, surprisingly, if you just look at the aggregate numbers, was not that different. We had a large trade deficit then, we have a large trade deficit now. The basic patterns of who our biggest trading partners were was basically the same in 2015 as it is now: China, Mexico, Canada, European Union. And the difference has been, since then, a very much more confrontational approach to a lot of different trade issues. So before 2015, if the United States had a problem with another country's trade policies, which we absolutely did, and we did lots of different things to remedy those, we would go and try to negotiate a free trade deal with that country. We would address those issues in that negotiation. It would take many years to do that. We'd come to some kind of an agreement that both sides could live with. And we did this with lots of countries in Latin America, especially during the second Bush administration, and that was how we went about addressing those concerns. Now, the way we go about addressing those concerns seems to be with tariffs and with threatening to cut off trading relationships and using that to try to get other countries to change their behavior. We saw that with Donald Trump first, but then Joe Biden kept in place a lot of Donald Trump's tariff policies, and then now Trump is taking what was already in place and doing it, scaling it up almost times 10. So it is a departure from the way that policy was done in the past.
And I guess we'll get into whether that was a good shift or a bad shift in your view, but let's go to Stephen. Were things acceptable in 2015 or?
Well, I think there were three sort of really big problems that we were facing. One, we had an economic problem. Middle class wages had stagnated basically from 1999 to 2015. If you look at real median household incomes, it was pretty much flat throughout that whole 16-year period, which is a very long period to ask middle-class Americans to not put up with any sort of an increase. Then we had a geopolitical problem, which was that we had gone from a situation in the late 90s where we were sort of not that worried about any geopolitical competition to a situation where we were now in this increasingly desperate situation vis-a-vis China, and yet we were heavily integrated with China economically, so that a lot of the tactics that we had used in the 20th century against other geopolitical competitors weren't really going to work. And these two things together, the economic problem and the geopolitical problem, created a big political problem for the establishment people in both parties, because I think, as Dominic accurately states, they had largely taken trade off the table in terms of a policy process. There were very, very limited things that elected officials were supposed to do in the trade space. But for the most part, ever since the mid-90s, they had sort of mainly agreed to kind of leave trade to the lawyers and to the experts. And so you have this gap between what the voters want, which is some sort of movement on these issues, and what the establishment parties were willing and able to do. And that's kind of where I think Trump sort of walked into that and said, well, the stuff that they're not willing to do, I am willing to do.
Yeah, so that's a great transition to my question, which is, in that context of 2015, thinking about the first Trump administration's posture to trade policy. So given what the both of you just said, do you think that the first Trump administration sort of effectively addressed the things that were wrong in 2015? And do you think it damaged any of the things that were right?
So I think the most important thing that you got to remember going back to 2015 is that you had this sort of built-in idea that had become very much the conventional wisdom in Washington, which is that elected officials aren't really supposed to make trade policy. They're like, trade policy is set at the WTO and is set through trade agreements that are negotiated by trade officials, and that members of Congress and the White House are supposed to have a much more limited role in terms of making trade policy. And if they do get involved, well, it's just all going to be smoot-hawley, right? You're just going to wreck the economy and screw everything up. So I think it was very important in the first term to show people that you could impose tariffs on a country like China and the economy would not show a significant negative impact. You could go to countries like Canada and Mexico and say, we want to renegotiate NAFTA, and they would come to the table and they would agree to renegotiate NAFTA. So you had to show people that you could do trade policy again. And I think once we did that, as Dominic pointed out, the Biden people kept a lot of that. And so ever since then, I think people in Washington are getting back into the habit of treating trade policy more like tax policy and sort of taking it and putting it back into the democratic space as opposed to being in the administrative space. And so I think that's a tremendous development. I think it's going to result in much better trade policies.
I think by the Trump administration's own measurements, I don't think that their policy worked in the first term. If you look at the trade deficit with China or with the rest of the world, it didn't change hardly at all. They think trade deficits are a problem. I don't, but that's their view. It didn't change hardly at all over Trump's first term. As far as China being weaker or stronger, I don't see any significant evidence they got weaker over Trump's term. I don't see much evidence that the tariffs were effective at bringing back manufacturing jobs. If you look at the share of U.S. workers employed in manufacturing, it has basically been the same since about 2011. So they're, on either side of Trump's term, there's really been very little movement there, economy-wide. And so what we do know happened is that the tariffs, they caused some price increases on products to which they applied. They didn't cause economy-wide inflation, but we wouldn't expect it to because tariffs don't increase the money supply. And so the effects, I think, overall were that the U.S. got a little bit poorer overall. They didn't achieve the geopolitical goals they wanted. They didn't fundamentally change the trading relationship like they wanted to. And they did so not by bringing stuff back to the democratic process. They did all of this through administrative rulemaking, through the president acting unilaterally, the White House, the U.S. Trade Representative acting unilaterally. They did not put any of it through Congress or up for a vote for the people. And so I would push back on its characterization as being democratic as well.
Stephen, I presume you disagree with that, so just curious to know what you might think.
Yeah, so for example, just to kind of go through different things. So the Congress did vote on the USMCA, and they approved it overwhelmingly. So that was the replacement to NAFTA. It was the first trade deal that was approved by Congress since 2012. It got the biggest vote of any trade deal, in decades. So I think that really showed that you could take trade deals to the Congress and get them approved. In terms of what it meant for the economic system, it was hugely important for people to understand that tariffs can make a difference. So when China, comes out and says, we have these electric vehicles that will, do severe damage to the U.S. auto industry, the Biden administration was more willing to step up to the plate and put in tariffs to prevent that from happening. So the fact that we, there were big improvements like I said before, real median household income lagged or was basically flat from 1999 to 2015. So then it went from 73,000 in 2016 to 81,000 in 2019, which was more growth in 3 years than we'd seen in the previous 15 years. So there were, and then finally, when you look at the politics of it, there is a reason why a lot of President Trump's success in the 2024 campaign was based on the idea that he was able to convince these working middle-class voters, when I was in there before, I really benefited you. And I think that has made a tremendous difference in everything. So I think that the people who voted for him think it made a difference. I think it made a difference. I don't think the goal here is just change the current account deficit. I think the goal is how do we have a stronger and more vibrant and more robust middle class, and how do we manage to have the type of capacity that we need to defend ourselves in the world? And I think the first thing you had to do is you had to convince people, we can do this. We can make trade policy. We've done it for over 200 years. We didn't forget how to do it between 1995 and 2015. And I think he accomplished all those goals.
So it does seem that the second administration has really ramped up trade policy in a way that we quite didn't see during the first term. We saw in the first term steel tariffs, USMCA, China tariffs, and now reciprocal tariffs, Liberation Day, and all that. Do you accept that premise that this is this a continuation, or is this a new form of trade policy in the second term? I guess I'll ask you first and then get your reaction. Since you were in the first term, you saw it.
To me, I think that it's very similar to those of you who remember the 80s, right? In other words, when Reagan started making policies, if you wanted to do deregulation or tax cuts, there was a lot of resistance to some of these ideas in the late 70s and early 80s, Vice President Bush referred to it as voodoo economics, right? So there was a lot of pushback and a lot of belief that supply-side economics wouldn't be popular. As the decade went on and people kind of got more used to the ideas of supply-side economics, it became easier and easier and easier to make changes. So that by 86, you could completely rewrite the whole tax code, right? So I think when people saw that they saw the results of the first term, he got a bigger vote in 2024 than he did in 2020 or 2016. People had the 4 years of Trump and the 4 years of Biden to compare to each other. All of these things gave him more policy space, right? So I don't think his goals have changed, but I think now he has more space to act than he did before.
I see. So he might have done this in the first term.
Oh, yeah, I think he definitely would have done it in the first term if he could have.
And how about you? Do you see any quantum shift, or is it sort of continuity, as you were suggesting?
Well, I mean, Stephen's right that the Congress did approve the USMCA under Trump's first term, and that deal mostly just kept NAFTA in place. There were some tinkering around the edges on certain things, especially related to automobiles, but largely it kept free trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And Trump unilaterally ripped it up in his second term now, and so without going through Congress at all. So I think that's clearly a departure, clearly a change. I think that the scale on which this is being implemented is completely different than the first term. In the first term, you had some broad tariffs on specific goods. So you had tariffs on steel and aluminum from basically every country in the world. But and then you had targeted tariffs on lots of goods from China. This term, we're seeing, in addition to those specific sector-specific tariffs, many of which haven't been announced yet, by the way. Those are still being worked out through the Section 232 and Section 301 processes that take some time. The Liberation Day tariffs are completely different. They're on basically every country in the world, regardless of whether they're a friend or a foe. And the amount of trade to which it applies is like 9 or 10 times larger than the amount of trade that was ever taxed in the first administration. So I think based on the scale and based on the tactics, I think it is actually very, very different. And we've seen different reactions both politically and in financial markets. And so I think we should take those signals seriously.
Yeah, so I'd love to pivot to thinking about some of the motivations and justifications for those unprecedented Liberation Day tariffs. One of the themes that emerges is fairness and this idea of doing to them what they did to us, right? President Trump calls these tariffs reciprocal. He points to things like currency manipulation. So the question is, has the U.S. been disadvantaged in the world trading system? And do you think that is a justified motivation for the types of tariffs we saw last month? We'll start with you, Dominic.
Yeah, if you just look at tariffs, the United States had very low tariffs before Liberation Day, so-called, but so did most other developed countries in the world. This was not an unusual thing. And the U.S. actually had slightly higher tariffs than a lot of our trading partners, but it's the difference of like 3% versus 2%, things like that. But if you look at those non-tariff barriers that are supposed to be the source of so much unfairness, there was just a recent report that came out ranking countries around the world. The United States is one of the world's worst on non-tariff barriers. We do that to a very large extent. The United States is the #1 user of anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties, which are supposed to combat unfairness. As you said, those are the tariffs that are used to raise prices up to the price of domestic goods. The United States uses those more than any other country in the world. And so the idea that the United States was some kind of like free trade utopia until a couple of years ago is just not right. The United States was the leader of a movement around the world to reduce trade barriers. That is absolutely true. And we saw the average tariff rate worldwide go down for many decades. I think that was a good thing. I think you can see in evidence from lots of countries around the world that have become wealthier that have been able to, and they've been able to do that because they've been able to participate in global markets. And it's not just places like China, it's places like India, it's places in elsewhere in Asia and Africa, places that used to be desperately poor, places that used to have lots of people starving to death that don't anymore. And I think that that is an enormous benefit that the United States should be proud of, and also that it benefited Americans as well. If you look to a lot of the wage data that Stephen was mentioning, we just had the Economic Policy Institute, which is a group that's backed by organized labor and has a lot of incentive to say that there's been this stagnation of wages because the unionization rate has kept coming down. They just recently said, you know what, look, this wasn't right. Wages haven't been stagnating, and if they're saying that, I think that's a sign that we should probably move on from that story that has been told by a lot of people on both sides of politics. This is not something that is exclusive to Democrats or Republicans, but I do think it is something that's not true. And it's been if you actually look at a lot of the median income data, it'll show that there was a period of stagnation, but that period ended in the mid 90s, and it looks very different now. And right now, median wages for a worker who has a high school degree but didn't go to college, so it's a pretty good proxy for the working class. Their median wages in real terms are higher than they've ever been, and they've been increasing since about 2012, 2013. That's good news. I'm happy to see that all that happened. Regardless of any of this trade policy stuff. It just doesn't really have that much to do with it. The things that really affect workers a lot are things like recessions and things like jobs moving around within the United States as well. And international trade plays a role, but not as big of a role as a lot of people think, and should not be considered the primary culprit for any of this unfairness that we might see.
So 2 points. First, it's very easy to just go Google and find real median household income. It's online. Federal Reserve of St. Louis has it, and you can look at it on the Fred database. And you'll see the increase from 85 to 89 under Reagan, and then you'll see the increase in the 90s, which is what you would have expected, and then you'll see the stagnation from 1999 to 2015. And in terms of a lot of you will see other studies in places like Dominic was saying, but usually what they're showing is, well, we had a big increase from 1980 to 2020. I don't think any of us are arguing over what the policy was in the 80s. The question is, what happened after China joined the WTO and we integrated our economy with China's economy? And there, no matter how you slice the data, it almost always shows a pretty significant stagnation from around 99, 2000 up until 2015. So there's that. The second question, back to your point on the non-tariff barriers. Look, you guys all know, everybody knows that for a really, really, really long time, and I mean a really long time, back 50 years, basically Northern Europe and countries like Germany and certain parts of that part of the world, along with countries in East Asia, tend to run current account surpluses. And the US, the UK, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, basically the countries in the English-speaking world and Latin America tend to run current account deficits, okay? And this has gone on for a very, very, very long time. And what's interesting is that when people write about this, it's almost, they often rely on some sort of a sociological explanation. Like they'll write stuff like, Americans don't like to save money, or the Germans are a very frugal people. And I think the president and his team believe that these things are not sociological. They are downstream from policy, okay? We have policies that encourage people to consume. And other countries have policies that encourage people not to buy our goods. And that this is why these current account deficits, which should, at least according to economic theory, they should correct over time because countries shouldn't want to buy that many American assets. But they do. And so I think the president and his team believe these things are not downstream of sociology, they're downstream of policy. And until you change the policies, you're not going to change the balances. And having a world in which every single year the Americans are selling $800 billion worth of assets to cover their current account deficit is an unstable and a politically difficult world. And it would be great if, like they did back in the 70s and the 80s, the countries could come together and find ways to work this out. But other countries really have shown very little interest in talking to the U.S. about this, and therefore the president and his team are acting more unilaterally.
Just to follow up, because I think there's a lot of interest in understanding what was behind the Liberation Day tariffs, how accurate do the both of you think it is to call the tariffs that were imposed that day reciprocal tariffs?
Completely inaccurate. They made no pretense of it actually being accurate. If you look at the formula they used to calculate these tariffs, all that they did was divide the amount of imports from that country by they divided the trade deficit with that country by the amount of imports from that country. It had nothing to do. They did not in any way take into account the other countries' policies. They didn't do any kind of fact finding on what those countries were doing. They just did a very simple formula, divided two numbers that you can get from publicly available data. That's all that they did. And so that's how you get crazy things like, for example, Israel. Israel, in the days before the Liberation Day tariffs, they unilaterally on their end waived all tariffs on United States products. Now, we already had basically no tariffs on United States products because we've had a free trade deal with Israel since 1985. But there were a couple stragglers left, so they got rid of them. And so the reciprocal United States rate should be zero. There were literally zero tariffs on United States goods going into Israel. And the rate that they announced was 17% because of that formula. That was the only thing that they took into account. So I don't think it has anything to do with being reciprocal. And the other giveaway on this is that they said the minimum is 10%, no matter what you're doing. Well, okay, great. So all these countries, the United States has a trade surplus with about 100 countries, give or take. And the United States has 10% tariffs on all 100 of those. That's not reciprocal either, even on their own terms, which says that trade deficits are what matter. So no, I don't think it was reciprocal at all, and they didn't even try.
So last year, we sold $800 billion worth of assets to cover our current account deficit. We'll probably sell at least $800 billion this year. We've been doing this for a really, really long time now. If you look at the numbers and you look at the U.S. net international investment position, you'll see that the difference between the value of foreign assets owned by Americans and the value of U.S. assets owned by foreigners is now up to around $26 trillion. So that means that these are U.S. assets that are not owned here, they're owned abroad. The profits go abroad, the growth in the value of the asset goes abroad. We just work for whoever owns those assets. This is a problem, and the Americans have known it's a problem for a long time, and they've complained about it literally for 50 years. Nixon was complaining about it in the 70s, Reagan was complaining about it in the 80s, Obama was complaining about it when he was president, and the response from the rest of the world has by and large been indifference. And I think it is very reasonable for the administration to say, okay, we're not going to sort of parse all these things anymore. We're not going to sit down and sort of go through line by line by line and try to work this out. We're going to say, you are responsible for a part of the current account deficit. We're going to hold you accountable for that. If you want to talk to us about it, that's fine. But one way or the other, this thing is going to start to even out. And that, I think, is the way they use the term reciprocal. And I think given the gravity of the situation in which they find themselves, because I think the notion that the U.S. is just every year going to sell off another $1 trillion worth of assets forever, you guys have already seen how politically unstable it is. And it's not just us. Britain runs current account deficits. Britain has had political issues. Mexico runs current account deficits. Mexico has had political issues. Brazil runs current account deficits. Brazil has had these type of issues. If you want a populist movement in your country, start selling off these assets year by year by year, because you'll get it.
Just a note to my Econ 39 students, we're getting into balance of payments issues next week. So all this stuff will make much more sense then. Another sort of thrust of trade policy for many years has been manufacturing. We need to revitalize the manufacturing sector. It's been weak. Many of our jobs have been taken by other countries. as President Trump says. So I guess two questions. One is, should manufacturing be a focus of the federal government? What policies would be best? And are tariffs a way to revitalize manufacturing, or would there be other policies that would be better and tariffs might not make much of an impact? So the goal, and then what's the means to achieve that goal?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about Rust Belt towns in the United States, and by that people usually mean the Midwest. They mean Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, places like that. I grew up in Wisconsin. I'm familiar with that part of the country, so I know what they're talking about. What's interesting is, coming up here from Washington, D.C., I flew into Manchester, New Hampshire. Manchester, New Hampshire used to be a manufacturing hub. So did many other towns in the Northeast. And there was the Rust Belt in the 1800s was the Northeast, because all those jobs moved to the Midwest. The manufacturing center moved to the Midwest. And now we're seeing in the United States, the manufacturing center is moving again, and it's moving to the South. In both of these cases, there was some examples of international trade making a difference. I'm not saying this doesn't matter at all, but the larger thing that was moving manufacturing jobs in these places was moving within the United States. We're seeing it right now with manufacturing employment, especially in things like automobiles. It's increasing in the South. It's declining in the Midwest. And so, if it's from the perspective of protecting manufacturing jobs, I don't think the mill worker in Manchester, New Hampshire in the 1800s really cared that much that his job went away because the job moved to Ohio versus if it would have moved to Nepal. I don't think it would have mattered much to him at all. The problem is that he lost his job. And so what I see happening is international trade taking a ton of blame for these things. When, the high-end estimate in the China shock literature, the economics literature about the effect of opening trade with China and that's effect on manufacturing jobs, the high-end estimate for that is that the United States lost about 2 million manufacturing jobs over a span of 10 years. And that sounds like a lot until you consider that about 5 million Americans separated from their job last month. And 5 million did it the month before that. And about 5 million did it the month before that. We have an incredibly vibrant and flexible labor market in the United States. And so 2 million jobs spread out over 10 years, it has problems in specific communities, absolutely. But why did it have problems in those specific communities? Was it because of trade with China? Or was it because those communities were dependent on one employer? We shouldn't want communities to be dependent on one employer. That's a really bad spot to be. That means you're one factory closure away from a lot of people being unemployed. In places that have many employers, they don't have those problems because they can move and get jobs elsewhere. One of the things that happens in a dynamic economy is that lots of businesses start and lots of businesses fail. And you can't have one without the other. And so one of the things that we should be looking for is making sure that workers have those options, that they have flexibility, that they're able to change jobs. And we shouldn't be gearing policy towards protecting one company towns. That's a really bad spot for workers. You don't want people to be in that position. One, because if the company goes out of business, they lose their job and they don't have other options. But also, if there's other people not competing with them for their labor, their wages are probably lower than they would have been otherwise. And so it's just not a good place to be. And I think that has a lot more to do with some of the negative effects you see, because we also have positive examples. We have places, take Greenville, South Carolina is a great example. That was a place that was very much centered on textile manufacturing. Those jobs went away, and they've been able to replace those jobs with new jobs that fit more in the 21st century economy in a rich country like the United States. And I have some friends who've moved to Greenville. It's a great place to live. It's doing very well right now. There's lots of Greenvilles out there that we don't need to believe that every place that's affected by trade ends up being a place that's terrible to live in.
So, so let's just start with kind of the figures. If you look at the data, you'll see that if you started around 1970, you'd find that there was around 18 million manufacturing jobs in the U.S. And then you'd see that there was around 17 million manufacturing jobs in the U.S. in the 80s, and there was around 17 million manufacturing jobs in the U.S. in the 90s, and there were still over 17 million manufacturing jobs in the summer of 2000 when Congress voted to let China into the WTO. So as a percentage of overall jobs, this was going down. But in terms of absolute number of jobs, it was incredibly stable for about 30 years. And during that same time period, you have a lot of political stability in the US as a result, at least once you got past the Watergate years. Between 2000, when the time we let China into the WTO, and 2009, we lost over 6 million manufacturing jobs. So over a third of all the manufacturing jobs went away in less than 10 years. And that had a political shockwave effect, the effects of which we're still feeling, because those people were not able to replace those jobs. If you are a 52-year-old manufacturing worker without a college degree and you lose your job, the plant closes, you don't have good options. You know, it's not so easy to just pack up and move to Greenville, South Carolina. You know, what if you've got grandchildren? What if you've got a child you're trying to put through college? What if you've got a sick mother that you're trying to take care of? And so the effect on these people was devastating. And then the anger and frustration and upset that generated has rolled through our politics ever since. So that's one reason to care about manufacturing. But another reason to care about manufacturing is and again, this is a question of public policy. Like, we should be deciding this as a matter of policy. Do we want to have a manufacturing sector or not? And if we do want to have a manufacturing sector, what do we want to make? Because what you want and what the market is going to give you are not necessarily the same thing, okay? We cannot make ships in this country for the most part. We cannot make electronics in this country for the most part. We cannot make generic medicines in this country for the most part. Now, do we care about that? Because if we do, somebody is going to have to do some sort of public policy to make it happen. Because otherwise, you will remain dependent on China for all of those goods. Now, you've got to decide if that matters to you or not. But if it does matter to you, you can't sit there and wait for the market to fix it, because the market is giving you what the market is giving you. So, and I think that, you know, in Washington right now, you're seeing a very exciting and robust debate. And the Americans have been through this debate many, many times over what we want to make here versus what we want to trade. And for the most part, if you study our history going back to the 1790s, we've been really, really good at these debates, and we've made really sound policies, and we should keep doing that again. We should not give up on the notion of making trade policy. We were very good at it for a very, very long time, and I believe we're going to be good at it again.
You mentioned remaining dependent on China. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on tariffs and trade policy as a geopolitical tool, and specifically whether you believe the tariffs we saw last month make the U.S. safer.
I don't think they do. I don't think they make us. I don't think they, cause a war or anything. But I think it makes us marginally less safe. I would think about it. Think about it on the margin, right? Like, does having trading relations with a country make war with that country more likely or less likely? Probably more likely. Does abruptly cutting those off make war more likely or less likely? Probably a little bit more likely, right? So I don't think that is helpful. I think when the China question comes up, it's always the justification for tariff policy is always China. But China accounts for about 10% of United States trade. 90% of United States trade is with not China. And not China is really important, right? These are our friends in the European Union. These are our friends in the UK. These are our friends in Mexico and Canada and Latin America. A lot of them are relationships we actually should be prioritizing more. I think Latin America is a great example of a place that, United States relationships could have a lot of work done to improve them. And one of those tools to do that is trade. And I would love to see the United States, leading a free trade coalition of countries against China, because it's absolutely true that China is not a free country. They do all sorts of things they shouldn't be doing. They abuse their own people. All that stuff is right. Let's show the world. Let's show the world that we can do better. Let's bring together countries around free trade and around other shared values and try to assemble a coalition against China. If you look at worldwide economic output, China accounts for about 20% of it. The United States accounts for about 25% of it. And so the rest of the world is around 60% of economic output. That's really important. I would love to see, the United States, if we want to be tough on China or whatever, do some tariffs on China and let's have free trade with everyone else. You throw in a couple other countries that are enemies of the U.S., Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, places like that. All right, fine. But can we have free trade with the United Kingdom? I mean, why don't we? Can we have free trade with Germany? A good example is NATO. The United States is in a military alliance with 31 countries. That military alliance means that we share some of the most sensitive defense information. It means that we have our own troops based in those countries. And it means that we are legally and treaty bound to defend those countries if they're attacked with our own blood and treasure. We only have a free trade agreement with one NATO member, and it's Canada, and we just ripped it in half. So why is it, from a national security point of view, if we're going to make those kind of commitments with those countries, why can't we have free trade with them too? I would love to see a better alignment of national security and trade policy, but that is not at all what we're getting from the Trump administration right now.
So let's go to Stephen, then we'll go to audience for Q&A.
Yeah, so I think just very briefly, first of all, I think the answer to your question is yes. Without the sort of measures that have been taken, I don't know how much longer we would have had an auto industry. I don't know how much longer we would have had a steel industry. I don't know how much longer we would have had the ability to make a lot of things that China is producing now as part of its Made in China 2025 program. So I think we definitely need to have policy if we're going to be able to maintain the type of industrial base that you would need to have any kind of geopolitical competition with China. In terms of the other countries, the reality of it is the Biden administration, the Obama administration talked at great length with the European Union about doing a trade and investment partnership, and there was very little interest in it from the EU. There's still very little interest in it from the Europeans. And the reality of it is that the Americans, we don't really have a lot of jobs and manufacturing and technology left to give away to allies. Even in the 70s and 80s, at the height of the Cold War, we had very, very serious trade disputes with Japan and Germany because while we did want to have good alliances with Japan and Germany, and while we certainly made some concessions to Japan and Germany, policymakers in the 70s and 80s understood they had to keep an eye on their own people as well. You're not going to have any geopolitical success if you don't keep your own voters on side. So I think it would be nice to think that the rest of the world would work with us against China. The rest of the world has absolutely no interest in working with us against China, so that's just not going to happen. And we have to make do with the best we can.
So we have two mics on either side. Please raise your hand, make your questions short and succinct, and we'll get the panelists to answer.
Thank you for speaking here today. It's much appreciated. For Stephen or Mr. Vaughn, was curious, as you explained in the context of industrial policy, a potential concern that the U.S. is relying on China for the production of things like tech or ships or general medicine, seemingly things that could be important for U.S. safety. If the U.S. wants those goods produced domestically, what's the rationale in terms of efficiency for doing that through the industrial policy of tariffs and not domestic subsidies for production?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, so Washington is really wrestling with these issues, right? When I was growing up, and a lot of you can remember this, in the 70s and 80s, there was no major piece of technology that couldn't be made in the United States. There wasn't a single, we built rockets that went to the moon, we made telephones, we made whatever it was that was made, we knew how to make it. Now, all of us are using a lot of technology that we literally cannot make here, okay? This is going to be a major challenge for policymakers, and they're going back and forth. They passed a CHIPS Act, as you know, a couple of years ago, which was designed to encourage chip production in the United States. Part of the Inflation Reduction Act was designed to encourage manufacturing in the U.S. It's actually very interesting. If you read Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers that he wrote back in the 1790s, He did talk a little bit about tariffs, but he also talked about a lot about what he called bounties, which we would call subsidies. So I'm not the right person to answer that question, but I definitely think we will need a combination of trade policy and industrial policy to get the type of supply chains that we're probably going to need over the next 10 or 15 years.
Any questions on this side? I guess there's one, couple over here.
First of all, happy to have another Mason alum all the way up here at the end of the world.
Awesome.
So my question is about how once the Liberation Day tariffs were announced, we saw a lot of volatility in the bond markets. So I'm wondering, how does foreign ownership of U.S. debt play into trade negotiations, and has what's been done recently maybe pushed that onto the table as a stick?
Yeah, if you want foreigners to buy less American debt, a really good way to do that is to stop issuing so much of it. And I would love to see Congress have a more sensible fiscal policy where we are not running $2 trillion budget deficits year in and year out. Once you stop doing that, it becomes much less of a problem. But there's just not political will to make that happen right now. And so I think the national debt is a major risk for the reasons that you said, and it just doesn't have a whole lot to do with the non-tariff barriers on American beef being sold in the UK. It just doesn't matter that much, and so I just think that I'm all for getting the debt under control. But that is not the direction. Certainly not the direction that Donald Trump is going. I mean, in 2024 they took out any references to deficit reduction from the Republican Party platform. Not that they were doing a great job on it when it was in there, but now they're not even trying. So I'm not encouraged by that at all.
When I was in the first term, we spent a lot of time thinking about whether or not countries could use these bond holdings as sort of leverage against us in trade negotiations. It's harder than it might appear, because to just kind of take all your bond holdings and dump them at a loss, it's not obvious that would necessarily benefit the other country or give them that much more leverage over the U.S. A lot of it depends on how liquid the markets are and whether or not you have other people who are willing to step up and buy those debts. But certainly China hasn't really shown that much of an interest in playing that card. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out going forward. I do agree with Dominic that we haven't talked about fiscal policy. That's a whole different world. But certainly, I think the Americans are going to, have to think about how that all plays into the rest of this.
Other questions? I think there's one here and over here.
Beyond the discussions on tariff, is the WTO doing its job? I.e., is it functional? And are we missing something with the WTO not doing its job, particularly regarding China?
So I think we have to understand that what we think the WTO should be, what Americans tend to think the WTO should be doing, and what the rest of the world think the WTO should be doing, are extraordinarily different things. For the Americans, the WTO, they thought of it as kind of a voluntary arrangement whereby countries would come together and cooperate with each other to try to bring about economic growth and more prosperity and increased efficiency, market efficiencies around the world. But within that framework, individual nation states would still retain a lot of autonomy to kind of make their own policies as needed, especially in areas of real sensitivity to them, like national security. That was sort of how the Americans thought about it. And if you kind of read the debate on whether or not we should go into the WTO back in 1993, 1994, that was really the way it was framed. In Europe, which I think is really the dominant view outside the United States, the WTO is seen as a rules-making body that has the power to basically make international law. And that if you are a WTO member, you are obliged to comply with whatever decisions come out of the WTO dispute settlement process, almost as if it had come from your own legislature. So these two different conceptions have proved impossible to bridge. The Americans keep saying, we're happy to have the WTO as a negotiating forum, but we do not want the WTO setting policy. And the Europeans keep saying, we don't think you can just keep making your own trade policy without seriously violating international law. And so the two sides are just kind of frozen. And my guess is that they're going to be there for a while. But when you also consider that the WTO runs on consensus and that China is a member of the WTO, the notion that you can actually use the WTO against China is kind of farcical. It's like the notion that you could use the UN against the old Soviet Union. It's just not ever, ever, ever going to happen.
Any thoughts on that, or?
No, I share a lot of skepticism for those kind of international organizations as well. I don't think they usually work very well for a lot of the reasons that Stephen laid out. And he knows the ins and outs of the legal stuff a lot better than I do, obviously. But yeah, no, I share the skepticism of that, and I prefer the United States to just get rid of its own trade barriers on its own.
Any questions over here? There's, yep, right here, and then over here.
Okay, I want to say, thank you once again. It was great to hear from both of you. To you, Steve, my question is that, do you believe that if the share of U.S. imports increase, that means a reduction in American unemployment? Because, well, when we studied that unemployment, import is not a driver of unemployment. It is more a follow-up of economic activity. When the economy is doing well, more and more people are employed. That means people have better purchasing power and money to consume, and that means they will also import a lot. So when the economy is doing well, the imports will also increase. And if we also look at the data, the share of manufacturing to the share of GDP has stayed the same, around 10%, but the unemployment share has decreased. So do you think every single thing, the loss of job in manufacturing sector is due to outsourcing, and particularly to really blame China? To what extent is it due to really China, and it's not due to productivity and also the shift of manufacturing sector from labor intensive to capital intensive? And then,
Actually, that's good enough as a question, because we're just about out of time. So why don't we get a quick answer on that? We'll get one more question, and I have one last one I'd like to slip in before the
Yeah, I mean,
hour
listen,
ends.
I would just say very briefly, I think we ought to be asking ourselves, if we are in a trading relationship with a country that is engaged in severe market distorting behavior, okay, then the markets are not clearing in the way that they're supposed to clear, in the economic models. If I have a company and you have a company, but my company is backed by unlimited government subsidies and I can never go out of business, over time I will drive you out of business, no matter how hard you work and no matter how good your company is. So I think anytime we see those distortions in the market, then resources are not being allocated in an efficient manner.
Yeah, I would just say, level of imports and the trade deficit of a country are just not important measures to look at if you want to know how healthy a country's economy is. If you graph trade deficits on one axis and GDP growth on another axis, there's like no relationship. Some rich countries do very well. They have trade surpluses. Some rich countries that do very well have trade deficits. Australia runs a trade surplus, nice place to live, high GDP. The United States runs a trade deficit, also a nice place to live, high GDP. It's just not a relevant measure, and economists never really look at it when you are looking at evaluating how healthy a country's economy is, how strong its growth is, what the quality of life is for people. It just doesn't factor.
We're just about out of time, so let me just slip in one last question, if I could, to each of you. Put on your crystal balls for a moment. It's always hard to forecast, especially about the future. But how is this going to play out in terms of the trade policies that Trump has undertaken? at the end of his term, where will we be, do you think? If you have any sense for where this is leading, better deals, more friction, and just higher tariffs, what do you see? How do you see this playing out?
Do you want to go or do you want me to go?
Sure, I can go. I think there's a couple different things. So one, the economic side of it, there's been a lot of talk about inflation. I don't think tariffs will really cause inflation. And the reason for that is that they don't increase the money supply. And so we wouldn't expect to see a general increase in the price level. The other reason is to the extent that they depress economic growth, that's a deflationary effect on the economy. And so, you'll see price increases for some things to which the tariffs apply, but I don't expect inflation to change very much at all. And so, if you see, you already heard people talk about in Trump's first term, inflation was low, so that proves tariffs don't raise prices. It's like, well, yeah, they raise prices on the things they apply to, but not in the economy in general. So I would say inflation, not that big of a deal. The economic growth, though, is a problem. We already had a negative print in the first quarter this year. You could have more of those. Depends on what happens with these negotiations, which apparently the whole thing is always in flux. So it's very hard to make any kind of prediction. I think the last couple days of the stuff with China was a significant climb down by the administration. And I think they're sort of realizing, and there was some reporting on this, that Trump was realizing, like, wait a minute, this is going to hurt dock workers and truck drivers and all these people who voted for me. I don't want to do that. And so if that political calculation seems to work through, and it seems like guys like Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chief of Staff Susie Wiles are kind of trying to make those arguments within the administration, that could change things. But there's significant infighting within the administration on these questions, right? So you got guys like Peter Navarro, guys like Howard Lutnick that are very much more maximalist on this, and guys like Wiles and Bessent who are much more restrained. And so some of it will come down to like infighting within the White House and within the staff, which is just a terrible place to be for a country of 340 million people, that we have to like cross our fingers that certain people win arguments in different rooms in the White House. This is not how government policy is supposed to be made. Tariff power is very clearly given to Congress in the Constitution. That is where it should be. Congress should be taking this power back from the president that they gave the president over time in various different laws. They're not interested in doing that right now. So we're kind of up to like whatever Trump's feeling on a given day to know what the trade policy is going to be. When the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they split power up between the different branches of government and between federal, state, and local. Part of the point of that was so that one person doesn't get that much say. But unfortunately, we are strayed very far from that design when it comes to trade policy, and everything's kind of up in the air.
I think what's going on is basically an iterative process between the administration and other players in the economy. I think the president does, and his team do keep a close watch on the data. I think they're very sensitive to what's happening with wages and inflation and jobs and GDP. I think they probably put more weight on those numbers than they do on the actual trade numbers. I also think the president is genuinely interested in the potential revenues associated with the tariffs. I think he is very worried about interest rates. I think he would like to be in a stronger fiscal position. I think he thinks that the tariffs can help in that regard. So I think what you're going to see is something along the following lines. I think a lot of these tariffs will stay in place. I think the tariffs on China will range somewhere between 30 and 40% about where they are now. I think tariffs on the rest of the world, will probably, some countries will get 10%, some countries might be a little more than 10%, some countries might be less than that. I think the tariffs will be bringing in $200 or $300 billion a year in revenue. And beyond that, I think they will have a mild distributive effect. In other words, I think the business community will hire more Americans than it would have preferred to hire. And I think the business community will pay those Americans higher wages than they would like to pay. And I think that, in turn, will have a significant political effect. Because I think some of this kind of despair and hopelessness that's kind of been flowing through our politics ever since the housing bubble burst will be alleviated. So I think for the people here in this room, I don't think you guys will see much of a difference in your own individual lives. But I do think if the voters believe that if they go into the 2028 cycle thinking that this has been a pretty good economy, that will have a major political impact and will then drive the debate in Washington for a really long time.
Great. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. It's time to begin Green Key Weekend. Before we do so, panelists for a great discussion, and come on up if you have further questions.